talk, which is hosted by the Biology Department DEI Committee.
Thank you for being here, everyone. I am very happy to, oops, this direction. Very happy to introduce Dr. Madhusudan Katti, who is an associate professor in the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program for Leadership in Public Science and the Department of Forestry and Environmental Sciences of North Carolina State University. He is editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of the Ecological Society of America. As an ecologist by training, he now engages local communities and the broader public in studying how human activity and histories of colonization and segregation shape the distribution of nature and biodiversity in urban areas. His work centers reconciliation ecology, the application of evolutionary ecology to find real-world solutions for reconciling biodiversity conservation with human well-being. He's also interested in the ethics of ecological research, nature conservation, and of how humans learn to live with other species. He is actively engaged in rethinking and redesigning his own research and the teaching of ecology and conservation biology within a broader framework of decolonizing science. Wow, sorry, that's a big word for me. So without further ado, I have Dr. Katti for you.
Thank you for that introduction, Nicole, and for this invitation. I'm happy to be here, although a little sad that I can't join you for that tea. That sounds really good. But it's nice to be here, at least virtually. And I hope everyone can hear me all right.
Yes.
So, okay, good. So what I'm presenting today is some of the work I've been doing in both creating a framework for how we address the colonial history of our disciplines and how we start working on changing our research praxis towards both, resolving some of the historical problems in our disciplines, but also towards addressing racism, systemic oppression, and then, towards like inclusivity and more justice in our research. And I'm going to be giving examples from my own, some of my own research in urban ecology. So before I get deeper into that, let me start by first sharing where I am today. It's a beautiful afternoon here after cold, but we had a fair amount of rain yesterday. And I'm at NC State University, which is located as, if you've seen this maps like these from the nativeland.ca website, you can see there's a lot of overlapping histories and geographies of people before Columbus, people who lived in these places. So in terms of where I'm located, I work in the traditional territories of several indigenous people groups, including the Tutello and Saponi peoples. Today, the Saponi are organized as 3 tribes who live in central North Carolina: the Occaneechi Band, the Saponi tribe, and the Halua Saponi Indian tribe. And North Carolina as a whole is home to 8 state or federally recognized tribes and more than 120,000 Native American residents, many of whom actually live in urban areas. And of course, we do these acknowledgements and more people are doing them, but there's also a question of what does it mean? Right? What does acknowledging the land at the beginning of a talk mean? And for me, what I can say is that it's acknowledging the sort of contradiction that I live in, because I'm a professor, I'm an immigrant from India. I'm a professor at North Carolina State University, which is a land grant or land grab university, which is supposed to be serving all the peoples of North Carolina. But the foundation of the university is rooted in colonial acquisition of land. So how does one speak about and work to decolonize one's scholarly work while working at an institution that is literally a living monument to colonialism? Right? This is something that I wrestle with, and I think we all need to think about where we sit in the context, in the historical context and the present day context of these sorts of power relationships and socio-political contexts. And beyond acknowledging things, we need to move towards addressing some of those issues. Sorry, this is okay. And then I also want to do acknowledge the people who have contributed to some of the work I'm presenting today. Primarily, my two co-authors on the paper that this work draws upon, Chris Trissos and Jess Auerbach, who are both currently in South Africa. They are from South Africa and they're back, in their hometown in Cape Town. My graduate students and family members, as well as a whole host of mentors, collaborators, and community members and others who have helped shape my thinking on this. And in a sense, I've said this before, that I like to think of this as essentially what has been my inner monologue throughout my career, as I started from India and came to the US to graduate school, and then have continued as a faculty member here. These thoughts have been at the back of my mind, and it's only in the last several years that I've been presenting this. So I want to start with this quote that you may be familiar with, right, from Aldo Leopold, one of the big founding figures in North American conservation. This is from the Sand County Almanac, and is one of the sort of foundations of the land ethic idea that stems from Leopold's work. And he said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite visible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Now, how many of you have heard this or seen this quote before? A few of you, right? So this is, certainly for a certain generation of ecologists, I think this resonates a lot. And there is truth here. There are values that drive many people into dedicating their lives towards conservation and developing the land ethic. But I think there's something crucial missing in this perspective. Leopold was a white man representing the settler colonial culture, nation in the US. And I want to share another quote by an indigenous person. This is Luther Standing Bear, who is quoted as saying, only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us, it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded by the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families that we loved, was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was that for us the Wild West began. Now think about the two statements here from people who are living in what is now the US, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think their lives probably overlapped, but within the same approximate time frame. So what is missing in Leopold's perspective, and what's missing from a lot of what motivates ecology and conservation, is that while we recognize the wounds made to the land and to ecosystems, we don't see the wounds made to people who lived in those very ecosystems and the land we are trying to protect. Right? So I submit to you that in order to really think about the consequences of what these wounds are, that we do live in a world of wounds, but the wounds go beyond what's are visible simply in the landscape and the plants and animals we see in any given location, but they also must include the cultural and the social harms that have come from the activities that led to these kinds of injuries. And that's kind of the motivation of thinking about what is the colonial violence that has resulted in the world that we are now in, and how do we begin addressing that as ecologists, as scientists. So ecologists have been absorbed in studying a model of nature that does not often include humans. Right? We seek to study nature without human influence. Yet humans have historically spread to inhabit and influence most ecosystems around the world. So how about a more comprehensive approach to studying ecology with humans as integral parts of ecosystems rather than as separate and largely disruptive influences? And this is beginning to happen, but it still doesn't happen to the extent that it needs to. I think we need to rethink how we think of humans, place in nature. So, going back again to the history of conservation in the US, and the big model of conservation that came out of conservation in the US and has become a model worldwide is the model of national parks. And one of the early, famous examples is the Yosemite National Park. I don't know if you've been there. I worked in Fresno, California for a dozen years. I've been there a few times. But something that you may not know, or certainly isn't shared often in the park's history, is the fact that the Yosemite Valley, that looks so pristine and beautiful in those Ansel Adams images, actually was inhabited by the Awanichi people for a long time. And they were actively evicted by government forces at the instigation of John Muir, one of the founders of the national park and conservation in the US. And these people were actively displaced in order to create what we are told is a pristine wilderness national park, which now gets millions of people visiting it. So there's, again, layers of contradictions to think of there. But removing the people had consequences, obviously, on the people, because they were displaced, and the colonial violence has the effects of that have persisted for them. But it also had lasting effects on the ecosystem itself, on what Muir and others were ostensibly trying to protect. Right? You're familiar with the fires that have become so common in the summers throughout the West. And Yosemite has seen multiple fires. This is the massive rim fire in 2013. This was when I was still in Fresno, and I remember, the smoke from these, and we actually got ash falling in Fresno on our cars from the intensity of this fire. Why are these fires so intense now? Well, one of the things that came with the science-informed protection of Yosemite as a national park was the science-informed decision to suppress fire and let the forest grow. And as you can see in the two images from 1866 to 1961, there's a pretty, visible, significant difference in forest in tree cover on the landscape. So a century of forest fire suppression has led to a buildup of a lot of fuel, which now results in much more devastating fires. Right? So science told us that the fire must be suppressed, and it took scientists a century to realize that these forests and these ecosystems are actually, adapted to fire, and that human beings, the people who lived there, use fire as a tool for landscape management. So this has been part of the history of the place and the part of the way that people engaged with their natural ecosystem in that area before colonizers came along and before colonial science came along to say, we know better how to manage this landscape and this is how we should do it. And then it took another 100 years before fire ecologists realized that this is what we actually need to do. So now we are back to trying to do prescribed burns to try and prevent these kinds of fires. So this is in Sequoia National Park, which is next to Yosemite, just a couple of years ago. Massive fires, and including the giant sequoias, some of them were on fire. And one of the more poignant images that I saw in the news from that time was this image of the General Sherman tree. Right? It's called the Sherman tree, which is again, named after a military figure in US history. But this is one of the well-known, one of the largest trees on the planet. And here you have a crew of firefighters who are wrapping the base of the tree in fire protective blankets to try and save it. And this image really stays with me also because this also shows us that people, can care for these trees and for biodiversity and ecosystems at a very deep level. I see this as an act of love for trying to protect this one tree that means so much to so many people. But we need to expand that consciousness to think about everything else that happens around there as well. That includes humans too. So Yosemite is a wounded social ecological system. Right? We need to think about the social and the ecological together. And what I study in is perhaps at the other end of the spectrum from some place like Yosemite. I work in cities, and cities have, for the last few decades, have explicitly been described as social ecological systems. But it's also only recently that we are beginning to pay attention to the social wounds that are part of the city social ecological system as well. So this is a paper by Christopher Schell and colleagues in 2020. These are all Black authors who published this paper where they took a broader lens to look at what shapes urban environments and ecological and evolutionary interactions in cities. And I'm not going to go through the details of this. Figure it's quite intricate and really well worth studying. So I encourage you to seek out the paper if you haven't seen it already. But the key thing is, as ecologists, we tend to focus on aspects that are in that gray box in this figure on the left here, where we look at, impervious surfaces, we look at climate, heat island effects, we look at green space, and so on, and up to biodiversity, which is where my focus is. But underlying all of that is a history of how people have settled in the city, how they've built the city. And that comes with a whole lot of political, social, interactions and history and power dynamics that shape the geography of the city. And in order to understand the distribution of nature and biodiversity and all these environmental goods or services or disservices, we need to understand that underlying dynamics as well. And it's kind of interesting that I've been doing urban ecology for about 20 years. But it took, so I got into urban ecology as a postdoc in Arizona in 2000. And it took until 2020 for a group of Black ecologists to explicitly call out the role of systemic racism in shaping ecology and evolution in cities. And that's something to think about. Why is it that it took that group of scholars to come out and say it? We know cities are deeply unequal and unjust places. This is an image from Fresno, which shows the deep income inequalities, gradients of extreme socioeconomic inequalities. Fresno is one of the poorest urban areas in the US. There's a lot of histories of racial and ethnic segregation. And in general, biodiversity in many cities reflects a lot of these gradients. So that's sort of setting a context for how I came to work on this paper with Chris Trissos and Jess Auerbach. So this was a paper that we published now a year and a half ago. And we were somewhat apprehensive about how people might receive this. But in general, the response was positive right off the bat. And I also want to say that, we drew on a lot of work on decolonization that's been done much more so in the social sciences and humanities, right? So ecologists are only recently beginning to address the impacts of these. So there's a lot of work that you can draw upon, and I draw upon some of this in the decolonizing science course that I now teach. But I encourage you to look beyond the ecology literature to start looking at frameworks and critiques that people have presented. Our paper has just a couple of figures, and the first figure is this one, which shows a map of the distribution of bird species that are named after European surnames. Right? So it's essentially a heat map. And you can see that there's a large number of bird species that are named after Europeans that you find in South America and Africa, right? Places far from Europe, but places that were colonized by Europeans. Something to think about. Why would European family last names should be given to birds in, Brazil or Colombia? So one of the funny reactions we got was of course, on Twitter from a few, accounts with pretty large followings in the right wing who were really upset with the map. And they were really upset. They thought it was a stupid effing map. And apparently the compass only points north. So that was something new I learned. But in general, people were accusing us of, whatever, woke ideology, turning nature into a Tumblr blog, or getting peer reviewed by Teen Woke, which I don't think it would be a bad thing given what Teen Woke publishes these days. But in general, it was amusing, but it's also something that you got to think about. Why does just the map and the fact that it's presented in what appears to be upside down should provoke such a strong reaction? Somebody even went to the extent of fixing the map for us. And you can see on the right-hand side there that they fixed the map. And we laughed at it, but I keep coming back to this because it shows how deeply embedded a colonial perspectives are. Because if you really think about the map and why Europe is up at the north and centered usually in the Mercator projection that we all grow up learning, that's clearly a result of colonial history. It's hard to argue against that. But that is so deeply embedded in people that even academics, when I show this, they usually sort of, there's a bit of a pause. People pull back and say, okay, this is an interesting map. You have it upside down. But it's not really upside down. It just centers a different part of the world, Africa in the center of the map. And it changes the orientation. But that alone shows you how deeply embedded colonialism is in our thinking. In fact, I've been looking at what shows up if you look for a world map. You just Google, political map of the world or something like that in Google. The most prominent maps that show up, the first hits are all Mercator projection. In our fields, geographers, we sort of know something about projections, and we can be critical of those maps, and people use different projections. But this is the most prevalent view of the world that everybody starts learning from elementary school onwards. So that's some deep colonial frameworks that are embedded in our psyche. So in this context, what do we need to do, right? It's not that difficult to critique ecology for its colonial baggage, colonial history, and some of the injuries that have come from that. But our goal was also to move beyond that and actually offer ecologists some ways of beginning to address those things. So we present this framework of 5 areas of practice where we think our thinking and our practice needs to shift. So these 5 shifts, and in this beautiful figure by the artist Karen Cooper from South Africa, note that these are arranged in a circle. And the point is that this is not a checklist. This is not a step-by-step action and go through these 5 things and you get a certificate of being decolonized, or you can put that check mark on your research. It's actually an iterative, ongoing practice, right? You have to engage in this. You can enter it anywhere, but you have to think through these as you practice your research and as you communicate and teach ecology. So what does decolonizing your mind mean? As I just showed you, we have certain things, colonial frameworks deeply embedded in our mind, like the way we think about maps. So we need to look inwards and find our own blind spots and begin to unlearn these colonial and oppressive frameworks. Right? We also need to look outwards and learn to see the world from other viewpoints, because the dominant viewpoint, which is what we learn through our education systems and in universities and so on, is one viewpoint, but many cultures have different ways of looking at the world, and it's important to pay attention to those and to try to understand those. I think it's important to learn a language other than English. I was fortunate enough to grow up in India, which is very multilingual, and I ended up at this point I'm reasonably fluent in 6 languages, and I'm working on my Spanish right now. So, but learn other languages, because language is a way that we connect with each other and with the world. So it's important to understand how nature or ecology are conceptualized in different cultures. Language can show us that sometimes. Because that division between humans and nature, this idea that wilderness is something where people don't belong, is the product of Western European sort of Enlightenment thinking. It goes back to Descartes and the Cartesian divide and atomizing things. So it's like, humans and nature are different categories. But that's not how most other cultures look at things. Right? Humans are embedded in nature. And I also urge you to listen and learn to actually actively listen deeply and absorb stories, poems, art, other many different ways that people express their relationship with nature. So how do these cultural conceptions that are embedded in our mind shape what we do? Sorry? Did someone say something? Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. All right. So, sorry, let me move forward. So if you think about urban spaces, right? Simple question, what is a vacant lot in a city? I'm sure, the city you are in has vacant lots. How do you look at it, right? Do you look at it as private property? It might have a fence around it. You can consider it as property that's waiting to be developed. You might think of it as a sign of urban collapse. It had been developed and, the city collapsed and therefore people left and now you have a vacant lot. It might be a sign of urban growth, urban expansion that leaves empty spots in between suburban development. It might be a potential urban park, that's exciting if you live in the city. It might be a plot for ecological restoration. Us urban ecologists really focus on these lots because we can try and do things there. It might be a vegetable garden in a food desert, right? So you can look at a piece of land from very different perspectives, ranging from this idea that it's a private property that can be developed and for profit, all the way to it being a communal property that's part of the commons and can be used for community gardens and things like that. So your conception of a space and a part of an ecosystem often depends on the frameworks that you're working in. And I just want to give a quick example of the importance of these kinds of community gardens and how people conceptualize them. So this is an image from a community garden in Fresno during the pandemic. This article, which talked about when everybody was locked down and the pandemic had also generated fears about Asian communities. And Central Valley of California, the Asian American community there has historical scars from what happened to the Japanese during World War II. So of course, there's a lot of refugees from Vietnam in that region, Hmong refugees. So this park, it turns out to be sort of a refuge for some of the elderly Asian American elders, both from the effects of the pandemic, but also from the violence that still continues to be enacted against Asian communities. We just had the incident in California just last week. So again, open spaces in cities can provide a variety of different benefits to people, and we really need to think about the history and how people engage with them. You may be familiar with the concept of landscape of fear, especially if you think about predator-prey ecology and so And the concept of landscape of fear has also been applied to cities. But if you think about the cities as a landscape of fear, with humans as the dominant species, the COVID pandemic lockdowns again showed that if you cut down human activity, you actually start noticing a whole bunch of other wildlife using cities. A different example of the landscape of fear in cities. This is an image of Jerusalem, right? And it's showing landscapes of fear and safety as people perceive them in a city that's been divided and has been a focus of strife between Palestinians and Israelis. And Los Angeles, there's this famous book by urbanist Mike Davis, where he again talked about the ecology of fear and how fires and natural disasters have shaped the ecology of Los Angeles. One of my former students capitalized on the lockdown in San Francisco in 2020 and was able to, as Jennifer Phillips, the second author on this paper, was able to follow up on long-term studies they had been doing in this area on white-crowned sparrow song, and was able to show that the birds actually changed their song during the period when traffic noise was pretty much minimal, right? When people were seeing foxes in the city and so on. So again, what we do in the city certainly shapes the environment for us and for everybody else. And that dynamic interaction between the two is what really interests me. But there's a different kind of fear that cities can present depending on what kind of body you inhabit, right? So if you're a Black person, then the landscape of fear and how you experience the city is going to be very different. How you even experience nature in the city is going to be very different, right? So this is Dr. Drew Lanham, who's an ornithologist in Clemson University. And I'd urge you to seek out his writing, his poetry, and his ecological writing. He was just honored last year with one of the MacArthur Genius Award grants. So he wrote this article about 9 rules for the Black bird watcher. Right? You might think bird watching is one of the most innocuous, sort of joyous activities. You can go out in nature. If you have binoculars, you can see and enjoy birds. Everybody enjoys birds. Yet, if you're a Black person, you have to consider a whole bunch of other things that a white person or someone in the dominant culture doesn't have to worry about, right? In particular, you have to think about, like, number 3 there, don't bird in a hoodie ever. Nocturnal birding is a no-no, right? Always carry not only your binoculars, but 3 forms of identification. There's a whole bunch of rules, and in the past year, I've seen, and I've been involved in collaborations where in my department, we are now beginning to develop some research practices and safety guidelines for minoritized researchers working in the field, because the risks that they experience simply for being brown or Black are not often recognized and are not part of safety training or even safety protocols from universities. So again, the landscape of fear depends on who you are. And of course, one example you may know of what happens to Black birders is the incident in Central Park in the summer of 2020, when a Black bird watcher who happened to be an Audubon Society member there was accosted or was threatened with the police violence by a white woman who was had an unruly dog with her in Central Park. And that incident was pretty triggering for a lot of Black naturalists. And one of my grad students, Deja Perkins, got together with a bunch of other Black ecologists and ornithologists and organized this Black Birders Week, which you may or may not have heard of, but I urge you to check it out. It's become an annual event. It started as being primarily online because we were in the pandemic. Last year, they've actually also had some field activities like bird watching trips and so on. But it's a celebration of Black people out in nature, as naturalists, as bird watchers. So it's really remarkable to hear their stories of the kinds of things that they experience. We need to know our histories. And in particular, something that we don't learn as in our science curriculum is how to interrogate power, political power, right? We need to know how, you need to think about how your science interacts with the histories that people tell. How well do you know the history of your discipline and its relationship to power? And historically, if you think about, evolutionary biology, you think about Darwin's work and his famous explorations, who funded those? Why was he on a naval ship, right? What is the colonial history that allowed him to be that explorer and to make those remarkable discoveries? What is your own gaze, your pose and positionality as a participant in the ongoing story of science? And, it's hard to ignore the fact that we live in a vastly unequal world. And a lot of this inequality is shaped by histories of colonial exploitation of resources and people. So in that context, what role does your science play in helping people? Does that even factor into how you think about your science? Does your science work to uphold power, or does it work to uphold justice and challenge dominant powers? And it's not easy to do those things, but it's important for us to think about and situate our research in these contexts. Speaking of history, again, this is from January 2021. So relatively recently that Smithsonian ran this article talking about the lost history of Yellowstone, another famous wilderness, which has often been described as, being devoid of people. In fact, some of the descriptions of sites like these hot springs, the famous hot springs there, even suggest early descriptions and even recent descriptions I've read. They talk about how this place was uninhabited because the indigenous people in the area were afraid of these hot springs and calderas, right? In the Yellowstone caldera, which is not only ignoring history and even archaeological history, but also infantilizing people there, as if it required Europeans to come who were not afraid of these places to go and explore these. So again, these histories are only now being corrected. Yellowstone has been, the National Park Service has been trying to, has incorporate the history and redo their signage in the park to acknowledge the fact that these places were inhabited by people. So correcting historical injustice can be done, but often it takes representation, right? So this is something that has happened under our current US Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is the first Native American to hold that position. Talk about living in a contradiction, right? Somebody from a colonized people being part of the Secretary of the Interior, which is the agency that looks after these colonized lands. Yet one of the things she's been able to do is rename a lot of locations that were named using a racial slur, right? So they've been able to do this, but often it requires not just well-intentioned people sort of, in positions of power, but somebody who has a deeper understanding of what that means, somebody from that specific background to even raise the issue. Yet, in science, we have similar issues. So here you have a duck that was renamed in 2000, the long-tailed duck, which originally had the same name as that slur, right? And here's an excerpt from, the notes from the meetings where the committee met to discuss this renaming, and there was still a lot of objections from biologists who were concerned that, some biologists were concerned that the name would offend Native Americans. And many requests had been made to the committee in the past years, but the committee declines to consider political correctness alone in changing long-standing English names of birds. Right? Think about that. The committee declines to consider political correctness alone in changing long-standing English names of birds. How arrogant is that to completely ignore the colonial history and the impact it has on people by simply saying, oh, these are just scientific or names given by scientists. These are English names. We are not going to change them. And what does that say to indigenous students who might want to come into the field, or indigenous bird watchers who might be familiar with these birds, might have other names for them, but you look in a field guide and it has this slur as part of the name. In the urban context, there's more colonial history that often gets ignored. And so one of the most famous urban parks is Central Park in New York City. But how many people know that this park was created on on sites that were inhabited by indigenous and Black and brown people? Seneca Village was raised to create this park because people who were building the high rises around the edge of the park wanted a clear view and didn't want to see all these poor people living in squalor from their penthouses. And again, that history is only recently being acknowledged. One of the images on this slide is a mural that was recently created to educate people about this history, this forgotten history. Again, reminding you that segregation, and racial sort of divisions in the city are part of the history and social geography of cities. So most cities show some form of segregation along racial, ethnic, religious, or if you go to my part of home country in India, caste, religion, and socioeconomic lines. And as it's quite clear to me that if you want to understand the biogeography of the city as an ecologist, you have to understand the social geography of the city as well, which of course puts more of a burden on ecologists like me because I have to now understand across multiple disciplines. But I think paying attention to other disciplines and other frameworks and histories is important for all of us, regardless of what ecosystem you work in. So you're familiar with the concept of ecosystem services and disservices, I'm imagining. Here are two images from Chicago, right? From the same year, two different parts of Chicago, not too far from each other. What do you notice in these two images? And you might immediately notice that there's a significant difference in canopy cover, maybe building density as well, but canopy covers definitely, the image in Hyde Park is definitely a lot greener. What else is different that coincides or correlates with this difference? Well, it turns out demographics of these places are very different as well. Hyde Park is wealthier, white. Woodlawn is more to the south side and more Black people. How does that kind of difference in canopy cover come about in a city that is governed, maybe run by the same municipal agency? Well, you have to look back into the history of how cities have become segregated across the US through this policy of redlining. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with redlining. Do people know what that is? So redlining was an official US government policy from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was, basically, I guess the task was to facilitate loans for people purchasing homes, to increase home ownership, because that's the primary means of accumulating wealth and generational wealth in the US. And after segregation was officially banned in the 1920s, what this agency started doing is they came up with this scheme of grading neighborhoods into different categories of desirability of living from A through D. Right? So A grades being the most desirable, D grades being the least desirable. And this policy was dropped in the 1960s or 70s. So it's been a few decades now since the policy stopped. Yet it turns out that if you actually look at many different parameters, for example, like tree canopy. So there have been recent studies in the past couple of years that have looked at tree canopy cover across several hundred cities at this point in the US, and consistently find correlations between the history of redlining and canopy cover with A and B zoned areas. So this is a map of redlining in Durham, but this is one of these papers from 2020 looking at, I believe this is like 137 cities. And generally what they find nationally or even regionally, looking at Midwest, Northeast, and so forth, that percent tree canopy cover is highest in the A-graded neighborhoods and lowest in the D-graded neighborhoods. Who do you find in these places? Well, the A-graded neighborhoods tend to be white, C and D tend to be Black and brown communities. Now, there may be a whole lot of other factors that go into this as well, but what this results in is a deep environmental injustice for Black and brown communities that are living in these places, because discrimination has led them to be in what were classified as undesirable places, where they were discouraged from buying homes. And now you end up with, in a time of rising climate and heat issues in urban areas and so forth, you have less of a tree canopy if you happen to be in a Black or brown community. Of course, that has effects on bird distribution and everything else. So one of the things that I study is birds, and I use citizen science to look at bird distribution in urban areas to try to understand that. And of course, you may be familiar with eBird, which is a globally popular platform for citizen science, sort of documenting of checklists of birds and gathering it. And it's very popular around the world. Millions of observations have been made. It's very popular in India. And data from that project have also have had tangible impacts with people incorporating that for monitoring species, for determining status of species, for conservation planning, including some legislation and things like that to try and look at distribution of nature in cities. And this is all really great positive benefits of having lots of people contributing data. But we took a look at eBird and compared with our sampling method. So I've designed this triangle bird count, just similar to the Tucson bird count and one I ran in Fresno, using a more systematic approach compared to eBird. If any of you use eBird, you know that anyone can upload a checklist, and there's different kinds of checklists you can upload of birds depending on whether you're stationary or mobile, and the timing varies, your skills vary, and where you go is entirely up to you. All right, so there's a lot of biases that come into that data. When you aggregate it over a large scale and analyze it, maybe some of those wash out. So what we did was we instead used a more systematic approach that covers the entire city. And we invite volunteers to conduct point counts of birds at very specific locations. So they don't have a freedom of where to go. They can choose the neighborhood they want to work in, but the exact locations are determined sort of using the semi-random systematic grid design. So we compared eBird data with our systematically gathered data. All right, so you can see this is for Raleigh. On the left, the next series of images are going to be the eBird data, and on the right are the systematic count data. And of course, you can see that eBird doesn't sample the entire gradient of the city. People tend to go to parks, people tend to go to certain areas. But what's interesting, if you look at the graphs there, they're again showing you that there is, and on the bottom, we're looking at different income classes. And it turns out that there is oversampling of some of the more wealthier income areas and undersampling of lower income areas. And this also corresponds with redlining effects in Durham. Right. So eBird, the citizen science platform that provides such a rich amount of data, is not only reflecting bird distribution, but it's actually reflecting the built-in bias of who gets to do bird watching, who does bird watching, who participates in this, and who contributes data. Right? Because people go where they are comfortable going. And if it's only largely white people who are doing bird watching, they're going to go to places where they are comfortable, and you end up with bias in data. So as an ecologist, if I want to look at bird distributions and rely only on eBird data, I'm not getting good data to understand the distribution of bird species. So citizen science can help us with a lot of things, but we have to think carefully about who the participants are. So who does the data collection, who does the science is as important, if not more important sometimes, than what science is being done, what questions are being asked, what questions are being answered. So basically, you have a lot of pros in terms of lots of data, but there's a lot of inconsistencies. And in general, birder demographics reflect social inequalities, and birders go to places they know. So you end up with effectively bad quality data. Habitat fragmentation is something that we all worry about, and in urban areas. So there was this big fight in Los Angeles, a big campaign to build this wildlife bridge across I-5. to connect these fragmented areas, especially for the movement of mountain lions and other wildlife, right? The famous Hollywood mountain lion P22 died recently, but this has been a prominent campaign. But the thing that we don't recognize is that those highways that segregate wildlife populations were often designed to also break up and segregate human communities. There's a history of racism, systematic racism and segregation in the way highways were built in Los Angeles. Right. So the Los Angeles freeway system is implicated in the displacement of Mexican communities in East Los Angeles. And this is a history that's repeated across many cities. So when you think about fragmentation and its effects on wildlife, maybe it's also useful to pause and think about the effects of these kinds of infrastructure on human communities in the same landscapes as well. You can see the correlation between ecological and human segregation effects in many places. So again, the wall you see is in Israel. It's separating Palestinian and Israeli communities, and of course, it's a huge barrier for movement of wildlife, and has ecological effects as well. The other two images are from other cities, in Mumbai and in Cape Town. In Bombay, in my hometown, it reflects a socioeconomic divide. In Cape Town, it reflects that as well as the legacy effects of apartheid. So there's a racial, socioeconomic, other segregations that show up in the ecology that you can see from space. Right? So when you can see systemic racism from space, then I think it's something for us to think about, and okay, is this something that we really need to address in our ecology? Other areas where we need to think about power relations, power dynamics, and how research gets funded, right? So this is work done by Chris Trissos as part of the IPCC work on Africa that he's involved in. And again, you can see the power imbalances reflected in where the money is coming from and where researchers are actually getting money to do research in Africa. And most of the money is going to Europe and North America. People situated in these places go to Africa and do research. Where is the money going to? Indigenous, local researchers who are Africans. Again, you can see a reflection of colonial power dynamics there. And something that, again, we need to learn how to interrogate these histories and power relations. And this becomes clear. So this is a paper from not too long ago, just within the last couple of years, that looked at 3 decades since 1992. So this is of climate mitigation efforts, right? First Earth Day, 1992. Since then, the Earth Summit, and what has worked and what has failed. And one of the conclusions that really struck me in this, scientific review article, that the common thread that emerges across the reviewed literature is the central role of power, manifest in many forms from a dogmatic political economic hegemony and influential vested interests to narrow techno-economic mindsets and ideologies of control. We really have to reflect on these and how they affect the science that we are doing. Inclusion is a big buzzword on all our campuses these days. We all want to be inclusive, but one thing that to think about is, by inclusion, do you mean bringing people who look different and turning them all into, training or indoctrinating everybody into the same way of thinking? Or are you actually thinking about maintaining the diversity of backgrounds that people bring? As ecologists, I think it should be easy for us to think about the value of diversity in any system. But often in practice, we don't recognize it in terms of human diversity. Diverse identities and maintaining them and nourishing them is important because people from different backgrounds can bring very different perspectives and insights, and those can only enrich our understanding of ecology. I don't see any harm, in diminishing of our understanding and of the quality of our science. So true inclusion would mean empowering people from different backgrounds to be able to set the research agenda, to be able to ask questions, to be able to, get the funding to pursue those questions. And I think if you look at the history of ecology or animal behavior or evolutionary biology, you'll see many examples where it's quite clear that when people who had been marginalized enter the field, the nature of questions being asked and even theoretical frameworks changed. Most prominently, if you think about women entering ecology and animal behavior and how some of theories going back to, like sexual selection, for example, were completely turned on their head because women came and started asking very different questions about how mating systems evolve. Because it's really important to note that even though we think of science as this process that gives us all the answers to complex questions about the universe, you only get answers to the questions you ask. And the questions you ask are shaped by who you are and what background you came from. So it may not occur to me to ask a question about some dynamic aspect of urban ecology that a Black person who grew up in a segregated neighborhood in the same city might be able to ask, because I grew up in Bombay, my perspective is different, my positionality is different. So if you want to practice inclusion, we actually need to allow those perspectives and those questions to inform our work. This one is straightforward and easy, I think, or not easy in practice, but easy to understand, right? We need to think about who owns data. There's a lot of discussions happening about this, even government policy changes mandating the data be made available and accessible for publicly funded research. We have to think about where the data repositories are held, though, and how they are used and who has access to them. In particular, think about museum specimens or samples, biological samples and other samples that are stored. Who has access to them? When you do field research, are you parachuting into disadvantaged communities to do extractive research? And how does research address power imbalances, especially between the global North and global South countries, and also between haves and have-nots within countries? Right? To what extent does my research engage African-American communities? That's something that I'm grappling with. These are images that Chris took when he was working on bird diversity for his PhD research, and he did a fair amount of work in museums. This is at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. These are bird specimens from South America, right? As somebody doing a graduate student doing research here might be able to get access to these and go to the Smithsonian. You might even get a grant to go and spend time there to study these. But what about people in the countries where these specimens were collected? What are the barriers for them to be able to, for a curious young student in Venezuela to say, okay, I want to go and look at these specimens that were collected from this region, which is my home region. They need to not only the cost barriers, but there are visa barriers, there are passport positionality. All these things influence being able to even do basic research of that sort. We need to decolonize expertise. And that's something that is tricky for us because we are, as universities and as academics, we are in the business of giving credentials to expertise. We train people, we give them degrees, and we recognize those degrees as representing expertise. But what about other kinds of expertise? Because people living in any area tend to have some knowledge of the ecology of the place. And citizen science is already showing us that lots of people who don't have science degrees still pay attention to and have good knowledge about the ecology of the place. But historical injustices also mean that what is recognized as scientific expertise is also skewed, because marginalized communities, women in the past or even now in many places, Black and brown communities, minoritized communities, lower caste communities in India, they're all excluded from being able to do research. So expertise is skewed, and there are lots of blind spots in the way we do our research. So again, we have to start rethinking what expertise means and how might we recognize that kind of local indigenous expertise. Decolonizing curricula and syllabi is something important. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. But one of the things that has really brought home to me by the pandemic and the way all of our communities were hit, there's something that we don't think about in our scientific research is we have to make care and community central components of how we work, how a research practice, plays out in reality, rather than being driven just by productivity and number of papers, but actually thinking about human beings, where they come from and what they're contributing to the science. And this was a lovely headline to see from, based on an article in 2021 where this new study in methods in ecology and evolution compared ecological knowledge of local populations in the Amazon with 10 years of conventional scientific monitoring and found that the local knowledge was more accurate. Go figure. Has the expertise here, right? So one of the things that Deja and several other African American students in my department are doing is they're actually investing time and resources to train minority, high school students and others in this area in birdwatching. Just taking them out, showing them what the birds are, giving basic natural history kind of training. And there are also a couple of them, Lauren Farr and Marie Burgess, have also recently created this this entity called Field Inclusive, where they're developing safety guidelines that they're working with a college to come up with safety training for with these risks factors to be considered for Black and brown people doing field research, but also looking at how do we make it safer and easier for Black and brown people to be able to come and do science. So I'll stop with that. I think I may have stretched my time a little bit here, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to linger here and talk. I can't join you for tea. Somebody can have a cup of tea on my behalf, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks. Yeah, that was great. If folks need to go, then go, but we can hang out here for a bit and talk if you want. Anybody have any questions?
I have one. It's Michelle.
Yeah.
Oh, was there someone in the audience though?
No, go for it.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I sort of had two. One was when you were talking about training people and some of the barriers. A lot of the whole issue here is addresses various social justice things, including kind of reframing our ideas of what's of value to our country. And I think one problem we have seen in our program is that when we want to admit international students, there's a whole bunch of kinds of support that aren't available to them because there's this, talk about colonial, this idea that we should train Americans or whatever. And Americans are now very diverse, but so it's not necessarily colonial, but this requires us to change the whole idea that it is actually in the US best interests to have students here and train them to work in their countries. Is there any progress on that?
I don't know that there's any progress in terms of policy. And of course, immigration rules and things are beyond our control, but I don't know if universities are actually beginning to recognize that yet. But this is one of the things that we
let them be, like they can't be NIH trainees, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So there are definitely structural barriers that make it difficult and that actually sometimes add a level of precarity for international students who come here for research, because your visa restrictions also limit where you can support yourself, where you can work to support yourself if something goes wrong or if you lose a grant or something like that. And of course, being a PI is limited, fellowships are limited. There are a number of challenges. And I'm not sure what I have an answer to that. But one of the things that we have suggested in our paper is to think about this imbalance, especially if you're doing research or proposing research in another country. And what would be great is if you can start thinking about a reciprocity in our research grants and programs where, ideally, if one person from here goes and works in Zambia or something, somebody from there is brought here, supported by the same grant, to learn from the US. I'd love to see that. I don't know of many examples where that's actually happening. I'm an
oceanographer. We see it a lot. You can't get permission to work in the waters of a country unless you have their people on board. People are insisting on
that, but I'm talking about actual bringing them to the US as a real exchange.
The other was kind of a comment and a question. I'm not sure what that background was.
Sorry, that was Siri picking up
that
on my
was
phone.
Siri. Okay. Well, thank you, Siri. Maybe she has a suggestion. The quote about, I think it was it NIH, whoever it was, it said, we didn't rename species for strictly political considerations.
Correctness.
That really struck me. It's as if acknowledging long-standing injustice and the rights and importance and poetic and other value of this history is just political. I mean, that's an ethical. It's not ethical. It's ethical correctness, not political correctness.
Exactly.
Okay. So anyway.
And of course, this was from 20 years ago, and now they would probably say it's woke. We don't bother with wokeness.
Well, okay.
Because actually these arguments are still happening. The North American, birding organizations and the committees that decide on scientific names, they are still debating whether things like, Bullock's Oriole and, a lot of names that are still given to species that have a historical, they're problematic because they're named after people who are racist. I mean, Audubon Society has only recently acknowledged that Audubon's own racism, right, in his history. So there's a lot of baggage that we need to deal with, but there's still an incredible amount of resistance, even though I agree with you. These are ethical, should be open and shut cases about, okay, we need to change these because they were wrong, but no, people resist them for various reasons.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I think, are there any questions here? I think folks are wanting to get to tea time.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you.